Life stories, a journey of love, loss, and redemption. What would you do if your own family abandoned you for following your heart? Emily was disowned for choosing a life they looked down upon, marrying a farmer. But years later, when she built a thriving business and a loving family of her own, the same people who rejected her came knocking, desperate for help. Would she welcome them back? Or had she already found her true family elsewhere? Join us as we dive into this incredible story of resilience, betrayal, and the true meaning of love. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. You mean nothing to me anymore. Don't ever set foot in this house again. My father's voice thundered through the walls of our family home, each word cutting through me like a blade. I stood frozen, my hands trembling as I clutched the packed bag I had prepared in secret the night before. The only thing keeping me upright was Jake, standing beside me, his hand firmly in mine. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of my father, who had made it clear that his love was conditional. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line, showing no sign of protest. My brother, Ryan, lounged on the couch, his smirk laced with satisfaction, as if he had won some silent battle between us. I had always known I was unwanted, but hearing it spoken aloud, so cruelly and without hesitation, solidified something deep inside me. I had no place here anymore. I turned my gaze toward the door. Let's go, Jake, I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. We walked out together, stepping into the night air. Behind me, I heard the door slam shut, the sound echoing in my ears like the closing of a chapter one had long dreaded. I had no idea then that it would take 16 years before I would see that house again. Now, standing in the golden morning light of my farm in Iowa, I let out a slow breath, watching as the fields stretched before me, swaying gently in the wind. It had been a long time since that painful night. The years I had spent away now outnumbered the ones I had spent under my parents' roof. And yet, sometimes, the memories still carried a sting. I was born and raised in Chicago, in a world so different from this one that it felt like another lifetime. My father worked in the corporate world, a man who valued status and wealth above all else. My mother, who had once been warm when I was very young, had become someone who existed only in the shadows of my father's ambitions. We were a family of 4, my parents, my brother, and me, but it never felt that way. Ryan was the golden child. He was the one my parents looked at with pride. The one who could do no wrong. Me, I was an afterthought. His birthday gifts were extravagant. His meals served first. His achievements celebrated as though they belonged to all of us. If I ever excelled, it was treated as an inconvenience, a threat to his fragile confidence. I learned young that there was no point in competing. Still, I tried to earn my parents' love. I worked hard, hoping that if I studied enough, if I was obedient enough, if I proved I was worth something, they would see me. But no matter how much I longed for their approval, it never came. Everything changed one summer during my second year of high school. Ryan was buried in stress over his college entrance exams, and my parents, treating him like glass, showered him with care. Meanwhile, I was left with the household chores, forced to sacrifice my own studies so that he could focus on his. I suspected they thought keeping me busy would make him feel superior, would soothe his growing insecurities. It was unfair, senseless. And yet, it was my reality. That was the summer I learned about the farmstay program. My teacher had mentioned it offhandedly, a chance for students to experience rural life for a few days. Working on a farm, living with a host family. It was meant to be an educational experience. But to me, it was an escape. When I told my parents I wanted to go, they laughed. Farming, my father scoffed. Only people who can't get real jobs resort to farming. My mother chimed in, amused at the thought of me getting my hands dirty. But for the first time in my life, I went against their wishes. I took the small savings I had from my allowance and signed up. Looking back, it was the single best decision I ever made. Those 3 days on the farm in Nebraska changed everything. The fresh air, the endless fields, the feeling of purpose in physical labor, it was nothing like the monotonous life I had known in the city. But more than anything, it was the warmth of the family I stayed with that altered me forever. The Harpers were nothing like my parents. They laughed together at dinner. They spoke kindly to one another. They embraced love so naturally that I felt like an outsider simply witnessing it. I had never seen a father beam with pride at his daughter over something as simple as baking bread. I had never heard a mother's voice filled with gentle encouragement instead of scorn. It felt like a dream, one I never wanted to wake from. And then, there was Jake, their eldest son. He was a year older than me, the same age as Ryan. But the resemblance ended there. Jake was patient, hardworking, and kind. Where Ryan had sought to belittle me, Jake lifted me up. He treated me like I mattered. When it was time to leave, I cried. I had never cried over my real home. But leaving this place, leaving these people who had shown me what love could be, was unbearable. Before I left, Mrs. Harper hugged me tightly. "You're welcome back anytime, dear," she said softly. "I'll come back. I promised." And I did. That trip was just the beginning. I started writing letters to the Harpers. To Jake. They weren't big on technology, so we kept in touch the old-fashioned way. Over time, those letters became my refuge. A lifeline to the world I wanted to be a part of. Back in Chicago, my brother failed to get into the university he wanted, and my parents' attention turned back to me not with support, but with pressure. They told me not to bother with college. That as a woman, I didn't need it. But I knew the truth, they simply didn't want me to surpass Ryan. They didn't know I had a dream now. I wanted to become a farmer, to build something of my own. I knew I didn't need a degree for that. But since Jake had moved to the city for college, I decided to go too. I wanted to study modern farming techniques, to learn how to innovate in an industry I had come to love. So, I fought. I studied harder than I ever had, despite my family's attempts to hold me back. And when I got accepted into a top university, my father was furious. "How dare you, as a woman, go to a better university than your brother," he bellowed. That was the final straw. After one last argument, I walked away. I chose my future, my happiness, over the family that had never chosen me. And Jake, the man I loved, was there to pick me up. His parents, my in-laws now, supported me through college. They gave me the love I had always longed for. And 4 years later, I married Jake. Not just as the woman I had become, but as someone who had finally, truly found her home. The day I left my childhood home, I thought I had lost everything. But in reality, I had gained something far greater: freedom. Freedom to build a life that was truly mine. At first, it was terrifying. 4 years, I had lived under my parents' control, making choices that revolved around their expectations. Now, I was on my own, with only Jake and his family to support me. Jake's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, were everything mine were not. They welcomed me into their home without hesitation, treating me as though I had always been part of their family. The warmth they showed me was something I struggled to accept at first. I had spent so many years believing love had to be earned, that it came with conditions. But the Harpers loved without question. Mrs. Harper would leave a plate of food for me even if I came home late from class. Mr. Harper always asked about my day, genuinely interested in my studies. They gave me something I had never had before: a sense of belonging. And then, there was Jake. Our relationship had started with simple letters, back when we were just teenagers writing about our days. But being near him every day, watching the way he cared for his family, the way he worked with such quiet determination, made me fall for him even more. He never asked for anything in return. Never made me feel like I had to prove my worth. With Jake, I could just be Emily, not the forgotten daughter. Not the girl who had to compete for attention. Just me. The more time I spent on the Harper farm, the more I realized that farming wasn't just about planting crops and taking care of animals. It was about community. It was about waking up at dawn and feeling the earth beneath your hands. About understanding the seasons, the land, and the effort it took to bring food to people's tables. I had grown up hearing my father scoff at farmers, saying they were people who couldn't get real jobs. But after spending years working alongside Jake and his family, I understood that farming required intelligence, patience, and an unbreakable spirit. It was a life of purpose. And it was the life I wanted. While I pursued my studies in modern agricultural techniques, Jake was always by my side, cheering me on. Unlike my parents, he believed in me. He never once made me feel like I was less than him. We weren't competing. We were growing together. For years after I left home, Jake asked me to marry him. It wasn't a grand proposal. No elaborate dinner or flashy ring. We were out in the fields, dirt on our hands, the sun beginning to set behind us. He simply turned to me and said, "I can't imagine my life without you. Marry me?" And I said yes. The Harpers, overjoyed, immediately started preparing for the wedding. But there was one thing left to do: tell my family. Jake's parents, being the kind and decent people they were, believed we should at least inform my parents. "We need to let them know," Mrs. Harper said gently. "Even if they don't come, they should hear it from you." I wasn't sure I agreed. But out of respect for them, I agreed to go back. It was the first time I would see my parents and Ryan in 4 years. I wasn't expecting a warm welcome. But I also wasn't prepared for just how cruel they would be. The drive back to Chicago was long and silent. Jake sat beside me, his hand resting on mine as if to remind me that I wasn't alone. His parents were in the back seat, quietly supportive, though I could tell they were nervous too. None of us knew how my family would react. But deep down, I already had a feeling. By the time we reached my childhood home, my stomach was in knots. The house looked exactly the same, yet it felt so foreign, as if I had stepped into a past life that no longer belonged to me. As we walked up to the front door, I hesitated. Jake squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens, I'm here." I nodded, took a deep breath, and knocked. When the door opened, my mother stood there, eyes scanning over me, Jake, and his parents. She barely concealed her disdain as she took in our sun-kissed skin and calloused hands from working in the fields. "No offense," she said with a smirk. "But how old are you all? You look rough. Must be hard laboring under the sun like that." Her words stung, but I swallowed the hurt. "We came to tell you I'm getting married," I said, keeping my voice steady. She raised an eyebrow. "Married? To him?" She gestured toward Jake, her tone full of disbelief. Before I could answer, Ryan sauntered into the room, his usual smug expression firmly in place. "Smart people make money with their minds," he said, eyeing Jake with amusement. "Only the dumb ones waste their time farming." Jake remained calm, but I felt my hands ball into fists. How had I ever thought this visit would go differently? My father entered last, arms crossed, his gaze cold and detached. "Let me make this clear," he said. "You're nothing to us anymore. You're marrying a poor farmer who has to sweat for his money. Don't expect anything from us. And don't ever come asking for help." It shouldn't have surprised me. After all, they had disowned me once before. But I had foolishly hoped that maybe, after all these years, they would have softened. That maybe, just maybe, they would care enough to be happy for me. Jake's mother, ever the gentle soul, tried to ease the tension. "We didn't come asking for anything. We just wanted to share this news with you personally." But my father only scoffed. "Well, you've told us. Now leave." That was it. No questions about my life. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of the years that had passed. As we walked back to the car, I felt an unbearable weight settle in my chest. I didn't cry, I had done enough of that in the past. But something inside me finally broke. That night, as we drove back home, I made a decision. I would let them go. For good. Years passed, and life unfolded in ways I had never imagined. Jake and I built something beautiful together, a thriving farm, a loving home, and a family filled with warmth and respect. We had 2 wonderful children who grew up knowing what true love and support looked like. Something I had once believed was out of reach. I no longer thought about my parents or Ryan. The scars they left behind had faded, replaced by the joy I found in my new life. But then, one day, everything changed. Our farming business was featured on national television. The segment highlighted our success, our innovative methods, and the thriving company we had built from the ground up. Suddenly, we were getting calls from everywhere, new customers, potential partners, and, to my surprise, my estranged family. Ryan was the first to call, his voice filled with entitlement rather than regret. "I'm starting a business. Lend me some money," he demanded. When I refused, he snapped. "If a woman like you can succeed, then I definitely can." His arrogance hadn't changed. Neither had my answer. Then my parents called, pretending they cared. "Why haven't you contacted us?" my father asked, as if he had forgotten the years of rejection. My mother went even further. "We raised you. The least you can do is send us some money. Give us $500 million. Or at least 500 million. I laughed. Not out of spite, but because, for the first time, I truly saw them for what they were, people who never loved me, only what I could give them. "We're strangers now," I told them. "And I don't give money to strangers." That was the last time I ever spoke to them. Surrounded by Jake, my children, and my real family, I knew I had made the right choice. I wasn't the abandoned girl begging for love anymore. I was a woman who had chosen happiness. And in the end, that was the greatest success of all. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring videos.